Last week I uploaded a video of me naming a player who had played for Sunderland and every other team in the English 92. If you haven't already, why don't you go and watch it? Spoiler alert, I got 84 out of 92. So let's have a look at the 8 teams I missed and the players that would have worked for them. I actually got all the teams in the Premier League and the Championship, so we'll drop straight down to League 1. Just like Sunderland did. Fuck off. With our first team being Exeter City. Aaron James correctly pointed out in the comment section that Don Goodman would have worked for Sunderland and Exeter. He was a striker that played for Sunderland for several years in the 1990s and briefly for Exeter in the early noughties, shortly before he retired. More recently, Don Goodman can be found as a Sky Sports pundit. There was also another striker that would have worked, this one being Marcus Stewart. Again, he had a couple of relatively successful seasons at Sunderland, this time in the early noughties, before going to a couple of other clubs and actually retiring at Exeter City. Another funny one I came across when researching this was a goalkeeper called Andy Marriott. He played for Sunderland on 2 occasions from what I can see and was a real journeyman. He's played for a lot of clubs in his career. But fun fact about Andy Marriott, you've probably seen this clip of Robbie Keane scoring a goal. Yep, that's right. That's former Sunderland AFC and Exeter City goalkeeper Andy Marriott. There are a few others, really obscure ones from way back. But these are the most obvious and interesting ones that would have worked for Sunderland and Exeter. Mansfield Town were the next skipped team in League 1, and as quite a few of you correctly pointed out, Liam Lawrence was probably the obvious answer here. He joined Sunderland directly from Mansfield Town and was part of a Sunderland team that got promoted and then relegated from the Premier League. Aside from Liam Lawrence, there's Nathan Bishop, who I actually mentioned in my video. He would have worked for Mansfield Town. He had a loan there. There's also a guy called Davis Kellior-Dunn, which I'm not 100% certain is how you pronounce his name. I hadn't heard of him. I came across him researching to do this video. He played for Mansfield Town a few years ago and was actually born in Sunderland and played for Sunderland as a youth player. There are a couple of others from way back when, but I've picked out the interesting ones, and like a few of you said, Liam Lawrence was the obvious one that I missed. The third team that we skipped in League 1 were Port Vale, and Aaron James popped up once again to correctly point out that Craig Russell would have worked for this one. He came through Sunderland's youth academy and was at the club for a long time in the early to late 90s before moving to Manchester City, where he went on a number of loans, one of which was to Port Vale. Another more recent one that perhaps on another day I would have got is Billy Knott, who was a youth player at Sunderland at around 2010, 11, 12, that sort of era. And he had a loan spell to Port Vale directly from Sunderland before leaving for Bradford, which is the other team I can kind of picture Billy Knott playing for when I say his name. He is a real journeyman these days. Have a glance at all the clubs he's played for if you get a chance. It's quite an extensive list. Again, there are more if you go way back when. I've just picked out the 2 that were the most interesting and more recent. There's a really nice article on a website called onevalefan.co.uk that lists 10 players to play for Port Vale and Sunderland, which I'll link in the description. Last but not least in League 1 were Stevenage that were skipped. And as of me recording this video that I'm doing right now, no one's left a comment saying a Sunderland and Stevenage player, which tells me it was tricky because there were some really good shouts in the comments under that video. And if no one knows the Stevenage one, then it must be tricky. By the way, thank you everyone who left a comment. I really enjoyed reading through them and being reminded of some obscure Sunderland footballers, which is a joy of mine. A recent-ish example of a player who played for Sunderland and Stevenage is a guy called Rory Deacon, who was on the books at Sunderland in 2011 but didn't actually play a game and then left to go directly to Stevenage. He's actually still playing, albeit in non-league football. There's also a guy called Steve Berry who played for Sunderland in the 80s, including in the League Cup final against Norwich. He later played for Stevenage on 2 separate occasions, back when they were called Stevenage Borough before they were Stevenage FC. One other interesting thing I noticed while doing some research for this video was that Dan Ballard, of all people, was born in Stevenage, which doesn't particularly help for this video, but I thought it was kind of interesting. Let's move on to League 2 now, starting with Barnet. Once again, Aaron James popped up and pointed out that Joe Hugill had played for Sunderland and Barnet. He was a youngster at Sunderland, a youth player, and I remember there being quite a lot of competition over who was going to sign him when it seemed pretty certain that he was leaving Sunderland. He ended up going to Manchester United, where he still is currently, albeit he's spent his entire time there on a series of not particularly successful loans in the lower divisions, the most recent of which and current one is with Barnet. Another former Sunderland and Barnet player I came across was a guy called John Oster. Now, if that name is ringing a bell for you, it probably isn't for good reasons. John Oster played for Sunderland relatively briefly in the noughties, although spent quite a lot of that time out on loan, after accidentally shooting a youth player in the eye with an air rifle while at Sunderland. Yes, you heard that right. It actually ended the career of said youth player, and while I don't obviously remember this event happening in real life, can imagine it was a little bit of a cloud over his football career. That's an interesting example, but for the wrong reasons maybe. Another example I came across was Gary Breen, who played over 100 games for Sunderland in the noughties before leaving for Wolves, and then Barnet, and then he retired. Like with the other clubs, there's a couple more if you go way back, but I picked out the more interesting ones, I think. Next in League 2 is Bromley, and I actually can't find a single player who has played for Sunderland AFC and Bromley. The best I can find is Carlton Fairweather, who played for Bromley in the 1980s and was at Sunderland for over 20 years in various roles, coaching and community and stuff like that. Unfortunately, Carlton passed away early this year at the age of 63. I also noticed that over the summer, former Sunderland player Connor Wickham was training with Bromley. However, he didn't actually sign for them and has instead gone to a team called Dubai City, where he's undoubtedly getting paid significantly more than Bromley would have paid him. Next in League 2 we have Newport County. Aaron correctly pointed out that Michael Spellman would have worked for this one. He actually joined Sunderland from Chesley Street United, a non-league team, and then had a couple of loans before ultimately being released and joining Newport County. Joe Gorman also points out that Antoine Semenyo would have worked for this one. He spent time on loan at both Newport County and Sunderland from Bristol City, the team he was at prior to joining Bournemouth. It's pretty interesting seeing Antoine Semenyo do so well in the Premier League, considering the Antoine Semenyo we saw in a Sunderland shirt. Another recent player is Jacob Carney, who joined Sunderland as like a third choice or youth goalkeeper from Manchester United. He didn't really do anything for Sunderland and was released. He's gone to a couple of clubs including Newport County, but nothing too notable to be completely honest. Last but not least in League 2, and the 8th team I skipped, are Swindon Town. Stephen Capper pointed out Nicky Summerby, who came through the academy at Swindon and played for a number of teams in England, including Sunderland in the late 90s. Aaron James also popped up again with a comment pointing out a more recent one, that being Dan Ballard. Dan Ballard's first loan away from Arsenal was to Swindon Town, however he only made 3 appearances there. Funnily enough, in my original video on the 92, I mentioned Shay Given as a player who played for Sunderland and Newcastle. He had a loan to Sunderland as a youth player. He also had a loan to Swindon Town as a young player, so he would have worked for Swindon Town as well. Johnny Williams would also have worked for this one, a player who played for us in our relegation season from the Championship, and more recently played for Swindon Town in their League 2 days. Another player that I mentioned in my original video as a Sunderland and Brentford player was Alex Pritchard, and one of the loans he had from Tottenham Hotspur as a young player was to Swindon Town, so he would have also worked for Sunderland and Swindon. The conclusion here is that there's actually quite a few for Sunderland and Swindon, so it's perhaps the one that I'm most annoyed on missing out on, to be honest with you. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed a bit of Sunderland AFC geekery with me. If you did, why not like and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next time I fancy rambling about Sunderland players.